Welcome back to the techno-communism conversation. I'm not going to work from an outline or notes today, which is generally a mistake because I'm a fucking idiot. But I don't feel like pulling up the computer. I was just about to run an errand um, on a bicycle, my main mode of transportation, and I found out that, well, I kind of knew that the bead on a tread of one of my tires had become irregular, uh, bent out of shape, or slightly stripped to one side, such that it wouldn't hold the tube in place. So riding more than a few feet caused the bicycle to the tire and tube to become unrideable. So I couldn't do my errand. I tried to fix it in the way that you can kind of line up the bead, even if it's a little bit damaged, but it wasn't happening. So I'm a little unhappy that my main mode of transportation is unavailable for a few days. And that's, if I look kind of sweaty, that's the reason why. Just futzing around with that, I did a dumb thing. A kind of dumb thing. I didn't have. I wouldn't. This bicycle is a little bigger than what I usually ride. It's a 700 tire, if that means anything to anyone. And I had usually I ride just the most standard thing, so I can easily swap parts and things at the co-op, which is would be like a 26 tire mountain bike. And a guy came up to me. I was in the park doing some riding, and a guy came up to me and said, "Hey, you want to swap bikes?" I didn't even see a bike. He was standing at the water fountain. I was a few feet away, and I said, "Where's the bike?" And it was behind him. And it was this nice bike, the 700 white cruiser. And he said, he basically said, "This is a nice bike. I think it's a good trade. It needs all it needs is new tire, new tubes, and I don't want to mess with it. It just came out of my sister's garage, but I do need something to ride." And so I let him take my bike around the track. There's the track there, and I said, "Okay, you know what, I'll do it." And then it was this day that the bike co-op was open, and it's only open 2 days a week. So I had to walk it over there. So I put an audiobook on, walked it over there, and got it riding. Switched out in some new tubes, used tubes. And it was a dumb thing to do. I shouldn't have done it because now on the other bike I had a spare rim that I would just swap out. It already had a tube on it, so just swap it out if I had to, and it had a whole system. And now, yeah. So anyway, I was going to talk about something else, problems of the 21st century and so-called U.S. fascism, which people sometimes push back on when you say the U.S. is fascist. I'm going to explain why that's wrong, but in a word, the main reason that it's wrong is because the U.S. Imposed a global economic regime, and it has been systematically imposed by the U.S. And the ruling elites of the North Atlantic generally, over the course of many decades, has done a thing that no avowed fascist did, which is quite likely caused the demise of our species or the death of many billions, short of that. So anybody who would say the U.S. isn't fascist because X, Y, or Z, it only hits 8 of the 9 benchmarks of fascism. I suppose that maybe the ninth being not saying that they're fascists, which nobody ever says anything that's true. So why would you expect a political economy to do that? Um, the but I think it was more correct. What I say to people when they say that is, you're right. They're not fascists. They're uber fascists. They're worse than fascists because they've caused the demise of our species. A feat Mussolini or Hitler never achieved. And so I called this the truest comrade because there's another, I think, a good argument there, and it has to do with more particularly with foreign affairs since the Second World War. So imagine this amazing person who travels from their home country in the 1930s to Spain to fight in the so-called Spanish Civil War on the side of comrades, on the side of scientific socialists. And this is a person who has a fairly good understanding of who fascists are. There are fascist regimes coming to power. This is a person who is more of a serious scientific socialist than almost anyone. She just kind of blathers on the subject, right? Because they've left their country to fight for that cause. If you were to remove that person from that context and give them, without putting names to things, give them a quick survey of world events since the Second World War, let's say, since their time, what the United States has done, let's say, in Indochina, Korea, the Middle East, South America, Africa, what has been imposed through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and so-called rules-based world order, the many, many deaths associated with that, the inhumane economic systems associated with that. If you were to show them all of this in world affairs, particularly what the United States military-industrial complex has done, but stripped all of the actors of designations, they would assume that Nazi Germany had won the Second World War. They would absolutely think that Nazi Germany had won the Second World War. There's no question. There's no question. And that's the essential logic behind pointing out the things like Project Paperclip. It's not that people should just be fixated on jackboots or something. It's that that the United States was Nazified to the point where thousands and thousands of actual high-ranking Nazis took pivotal roles in various sectors and government bodies, it's not as if it had been denazified before, so that idea that just because somebody says they're not bad, or on some level they believe that there's something good about them, that you can judge it on that basis and not on the basis of their actions, is utterly absurd. I'm going to, I guess, get to the meat of the conversation here, which is what a thing that could happen in North America to correct this. There's, in a revolutionary theory of analysis of ethnic groups in North America, there's a very valid perhaps the most valid thing anyone could say about ethnic groups in North America, a very valid analysis, which is to say that persons of Native American, that includes some groups that you would not specifically necessarily think of as Native American, such as a lot of Chicano people. Native American and African American people are the people of whom you could say they were not violent invaders or settler colonials on this North American continent. And so they have a right to be here. That's fairly obvious with Native Americans. African Americans were brought here against their will, and more or less the most significant group and force in the proto-industrialization of the United States, turning this into a place where people could have lived more than 80 years, absent, say, the neoliberal influence, on average, 80 years. And that's a huge debt is owed to African Americans for this. That's never even been discussed to be repaid, right? After this so-called U.S. Civil War, an inter-imperialist war between two white supremacist organizations, the things that were to have been done to allow African Americans to live, actually just live a life, were not done, such as even just paying soldiers the pensions that they were promised. Soldiers were promised pensions, and they were refused that. They said, you know what? You don't have the right papers. Where's your papers? You don't have the right papers. They're slaves, right? Of course, they don't have papers. This is always how in elitist institutions the rule of law is used to actually strip away human rights. Or of course, the most stereotypical example of this is the 40 acres and a mule that was promised. This was undertaken. This was begun, and then the short-lived Andrew Johnson administration, stymied this. So these land grants were beginning to be given. You can see this in the television program Manhunt, which I don't recommend. This is bourgeois filth, right? Because it doesn't really point out this essential fact that this was an inter-imperialist war between two essentially proto-fascistic powers. Formal fascism hadn't come into existence, but as long as the United States has existed, it's been highly fascistic. Formal fascism is a pretty specific response to the running of state socialism and scientific socialist institutions. It's the bourgeois systematically responding to the possibility of their form of government being forced not to exist, which it should not exist. So you have these two groups of people essentially who have a right to live here, and a thing to do in the 21st century to rectify this rule of law that functions in no way in that, and anarchists would say that no rule of law can function in that way, and there's a kernel of truth to that, right? But scientific socialists were able to build governments, and some of which still exist, that did ensure that disenfranchised group and working people generally were not the ones who were always getting the shaft. So the kind of anarchist analysis, it really can only be viewed as being bourgeois because it equates a thing that is very specific to bourgeois as being a universal. And in doing so, absolves these bourgeois institutions. So that's why, despite the good energy that anarchists might have in a given situation, despite the good work that they might do on the ground, so to speak, they're highly problematic from the point of view of actually building a force to fight against elitist institutions and bourgeois institutions. And so you have these two groups who, by this revolutionary theory, are not violent invaders, are not settler colonials, Native Americans and African Americans. And a thing to do in North America would be to try, in absentia, all other people, everyone who doesn't fit that description, and not do after these people are tried and convicted, not do the thing that the bourgeois so-called rule of law has done to those marginalized groups and working people generally off without true trial or trial at all, which is murdering them, right? You can point to hundreds and hundreds of examples of African Americans and Native Americans, such as a Martin Scorsese film that came out with Leonardo DiCaprio, who's not a great champion of the people, of course. But this film, like that show I mentioned, Manhunt, does describe something problematic in this area. You can point to hundreds and hundreds of examples of African Americans beginning to have something like a franchise vote, something like the running of municipal systems, or even just equity in systems of that kind, or a financial enfranchisement, and white supremacists, the same kind of people like and people in this Andrew Johnson sphere of influence who scuttled the 40 acres and a mule, so to speak. The same kind of people who then were allowed to run roughshod, literally, over African Americans in the years to follow. So not only were soldiers not given their pensions, and they had all of this money set aside for those soldiers' pensions, and then they just the white man owns the bank, and suddenly the bank says, "Oh, something happened. There was a mishap at the bank, and all that money was lost." Can you believe it? So again, the rule of law being used to disenfranchise the worker, because the African and the African slave is fundamentally, this is something that's under-recognized to this day by scientific socialists and pro-worker thinkers. There is no more essential distillation of the disenfranchised worker than the chattel slave, right? It's a person who, instead of having significant part of the surplus value of their labor stolen, has all of their surplus value of their labor stolen. That should be a person who is viewed as the comrade. But this is viewed as some kind of outlier set of scenarios outside of that, for the most part, by the public imagination, particularly pro-labor people, right? Scientific socialists would be said to be more particularly guilty of this than other groups, because the other groups don't even think about workers at all, right? If you're just bourgeois asshole, you don't think about workers at all. So you have this trial in absentia of people who don't fit that description of having a rightful claim to this continent by having been brought here in bondage or being the original inhabitants. And this trial in absentia is not to do what the bourgeois do in that situation, that is to murder those people That's not a thing that scientific socialists want to do, except when forced, because this Ted Cruz is going to lead a counter-revolution after the scientific socialist revolution. We can't let that happen. You just got to put a bean in Ted Cruz's head, right? There's no real way around that. But short of that, this the impulse of the scientific socialists is not going to be a punitive one. Just trying to ensure that a people's government can continue to exist. And this, of course, is a healthy impulse. It's born out of love for humankind, because the only thing that the scientific socialist cares about or is doing in this world is trying to build a humane and sustainable economic system and see that everybody lives well. But with the continued existence of the bourgeois, that is constantly a threat. So you have people who are incapable of making this analysis. Again, people who are poisoned by anarchist thought for the most part, because they would say the anarchist understands that pre-revolution you have to take dramatic action to stop the bourgeois, right? But post-revolution they don't seem to understand that post-revolution you would have to take such similar steps to ensure the continued existence of the people's government. That, for some reason, is upsetting to them. A thing that, by and large, could be said to be more important, or at least as important. One such thing in a revolutionary North America, as I said, would be to try in absentia all the people that don't fit this description, Native American or African American. Again, not to strip them of rights to life, their being alive, not to strip them even of material necessaries, which also is the other thing that these bourgeois European supremacists, European Americans do routinely. They can't just when they can't just come in and kind of sneakily murder people like in that Scorsese movie and steal all their money, or just blow up the whole town like in Tulsa and 50 other places in the early 20th century. Then they create a sham rule of law wherein they are stripped of civil rights or economic rights, which is the main reason that they would do that. That's the whole system, right? That's why the United States has more prisoners than any other country. Why it has 4 times the number of people in jail in China than China, a much larger country. Why? I watched this show, and I shouldn't have watched it, right? I'm kind of showing my ass a little bit because I'm talking about all of these bourgeois shows that I've watched. You shouldn't watch this stuff if you're not pretty firmly committed to scientific socialism and are able to criticize them, I guess, in these ways. So this show that I watched recently, which is still going, there's one more episode, is Gentlemen in Moscow, and it shows so many CIA talking points. It's ridiculous, such as the Soviet Union being anti-gay, which it was the least anti-gay place in the world in this period of time. It is the only place to fully decriminalize things along this line, and the logic there wasn't that everybody in the Soviet Union at that time was going to just be super loving of gay people, or even that the leadership all uniformly felt that way. Although logic was, and this is why other things were decriminalized that would be more controversial by today's standards, logic was that the people's government, ensuring economic necessaries to all citizens, would tend to correct anything problematic there. over time. The example I gave of the other things that would be more problematic is, say, a marriage to a person who is under the age of 18. That was decriminalized in the earliest years of the Soviet Union, and that was, or other things, bestiality, more controversial still, arguably. I'm not going to make statements suggestive that these things are not bad, because of course they're very bad. But the idea was that all of these things are a product of an inhumane economic system, people acting out, which is true. People acting out because bourgeois institutions have them at 6s and 7s, and if you remove that elitist institution and ensure that their economic necessaries are met, and that they are in a position to be a valuable contributor to this society run by a people's government, a scientific socialist society, then those problems will wither away, and that's exactly what happened. You don't have the doubling of life expectancy in 25 years if that is not fundamentally true. I mean, that is exactly what happened in the USSR. And so this show, Gentleman in Moscow, employs all of these ridiculous CIA talking points about the Soviet Union being anti-gay, about Holodomor, famine. It's so stupid, right? The United States had a famine at the exact same time for the exact same reasons. When people talk about that famine, they don't say it was secretly done on purpose by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, an evil mustache-twirling dictator, to kill a lot of people. You don't say that. And if any country is deserving of that analysis, it's the United States, right? Because the United States does that sort of thing. So, for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during that same time period, poisoned about 50,000 people to death with tainted alcohol that was intentionally laced with a poisonous agent. So that's because you weren't allowed to drink alcohol. You're not allowed to drink alcohol. That's a serious crime, so we'll murder you for that. That makes sense, right? But the United States, as I said at the beginning of this analysis, the United States has grown to be. You should watch that to understand this. The United States has grown to be a thing that a person who volunteered to fight on the side of comrades in the Spanish Civil War, if they didn't know the names of the actors, just had a rough outline of world affairs since the Second World War, would assume that the Nazis had won the Second World War almost basically based on the U.S. and North Atlantic powers' actions. So almost all of media is designed to deflect from that essential reality, such as characterizing a famine that occurred in the USSR as being intentional, the so-called Holodomor. So it's not something that people in this time believed. It's a CIA talking point that's since emerged, like the Soviet Union being anti-gay. Another example of something absurd along these lines is a show, does a show about, set to some degree in the Soviet Union, mostly in the United States and New York, about a female chess player. I can't think of the name of it right now. It's a little Anya woman in it. Little redheaded woman, chess champion. People at the time were like, "Oh, such an amazing show, really thought-provoking." And one of the main storylines there was that she couldn't go to the Soviet Union because women were allowed to play chess in the Soviet Union, which is the exact opposite of what actually is historically true. There were women chess champions in the Soviet Union and not elsewhere. Just like the thing with decriminalizing homosexuality, it's just a bizarro world inversion, and CIA talking points carefully peppered throughout all entertainment creates this impression in the public consciousness that the people who did this thing, this one important thing, that's really the main thing that they did, doubling life expectancy in 25 years, basically quadrupling of industrial outputs compared to that of industrial capitalism, which is the main cause, transforming the economy, which is the main cause of the doubling of life expectancy in 25 years. So basically, scientific socialism was 4 times better than industrial capitalism, which isn't even what we have today. We have finance capitalism, which is worse than industrial capitalism by a pretty objective standard, I should say. Um, just casino, right? Casino bullshit. Um, um, that this accomplishment, a improvement, a fourfold improvement of industrial capacities toward improving human development and quality of life, that can't be the story, right? That can't be the story, according to the Western fascist. So we make up all of these other stories, like Stalin being a dictator. So the 3 examples of this from the Amor Towell's book and Ewan McGregor television show, A Gentleman in Moscow, were preoccupation with the Holodomor, preoccupation with a little bit with Soviets being anti-gay, which by the standards of the time they absolutely were the least anti-gay people. And then the other big one is the Gulag, the great horror of the Soviet Union, right? It doesn't even make sense for a Westerner in North America. It doesn't make sense for a person of the United States to talk about this in this context, right? Because we have 4 times the number of people in prisons than a much larger country, China, because of what I mentioned, this specific racist agenda of oppressing people who would be the rightful owners of this continent otherwise. So a massive number of people in real gulags in the United States compared to the number of people in gulags in the Soviet Union was small, and it was people capable of things on the order of magnitude, sometimes controversially, but capable of things on the order of magnitude of what I said. If after U.S. Scientific socialist government, a people's government has been imposed, you can't just let somebody like Ted Cruz walk around and plan counter-revolution, right? That person would be doing very bad things. That person has to be neutralized in one way or another. If you actually care about something like the running of a humane and sustainable economic system, so you don't have things like in the United States, 100,000 people will die this year prematurely, or dramatically so in many cases, because we don't have a public health service. Is Ted Cruz and his counter-revolutionary machinations going to ensure your health service? That's the last thing he's going to do of this people's government that has a health service at that point. He's only concerned with reestablishing bourgeois rule, which is problematic because it doesn't do those things. Stop 100,000 people a year from dying of preventable conditions. And all of the other things, housing authority, a job guarantee, all the other things that would cause, in conjunction with the better running of industrial capacities, this fourfold increase in human development under the scientific socialist state, as demonstrated by the Soviet Union in the years between 1923 and roughly 1950. Doubling of life expectancy, a great accomplishment of the 20th century, which bourgeois forces have since dedicated themselves to making up silly stories about, so that you won't know or won't acknowledge or ever really think about that fourfold improvement. And that is why a show like A Gentleman in Moscow is, the Gulag was such a horror. Yeah, prison is bad, but in Soviet prisons, the work camp workloads were not particularly onerous compared to U.S. work camps, right? U.S. work camp, the U.S. prison system is a place where the first thing that happens in most places in the U.S. when you're into the prison system is you're forced into racialized gangs. You're basically forced to combat or join the KKK, join white supremacist groups, Aryan Nation, you would say, um, within the prison framework. Almost every state has some variation of this, and it's imposed by the people who run the prison, because otherwise those people are disenfranchised workers who are potentially organizing, and rightly so, against the fascist overlords who have imprisoned them. But when you have so-called prison politics, which is a word for these being forced into this racialized gang scenario, then you of course have a tremendous amount of violence being done to those people. But what you don't have is a real easy pathway to solidarity and thus action on the part of these oppressed groups. And this, of course, why any scientific socialist worth their salt is for prison abolition. Um, you know, it's almost nothing to do with this movie logic of gulags, right? A tiny fraction of people, and in this framework, for-profit prisons of the 21st century, that's to say, um, people are doing a tremendous amount of work relative to what people were doing in so-called the gulags. Um, so back to the central point here, which is that in this people's government, you understand that the only people who aren't essentially violent invaders of this continent are people of these two groups, um, Native American groups in the broadest sense, and African American people whose ancestors were brought here in chains, forced to work. They did not invade of their own volition. Um, and then the idea that I suggested is that you try all of the people that don't fit that description in absentia, and you do this not to economically disenfranchise them or to take their life, as perhaps some have argued is the correct thing. Right? Shouldn't be violent invaders on this continent, but the people's government and the scientific socialist is not a barbarian, um, except in the situations where there's no choice. You have to neutralize the threat, the bourgeois threat. And so you try these groups in absentia to take away specific political power, to take specifically political power from these people. So almost every serious African American scientific socialist writer of the 20th century agreed on one point, which is a people's government should be imposed in North America, but if a people's government were imposed in North America by the existing scientific socialist institutions, that probably in the near term wouldn't be a dramatically better outcome for these groups, African Americans and Native people, than what they had seen under the bourgeois government. The problem being that labor groups were basically all the European supremacist groups. This is not a controversial thing to say, but a lot of scientific socialists will push back against it. I think of the book Settlers by Jay Sakai, which is basically just all statements of fact along these lines, suggesting that the violent invader, the settler colonial, even if they call themselves a scientific socialist or pro-worker generally, is operating pretty systematically in such a way to exclude these more rightful owners of this land from those institutions. And so what you have is effectively social chauvinism of a very virulent kind, rather than genuine scientific socialism. And that's all true, but people hate Jay Sakai. They say Jay Sakai is a CIA asset or what, or this or that, because putting that lens on them and looking at this book, which is all just basically statements of historical fact, describing some bad stuff that happened along these lines, they would say somehow in total that's not true. So that problem of Native people and African people, serious thinkers, recognizing in the 1950s, for example, and before and since, that a people's government would not truly be a people's government because it would not actually be liberatory in those ways, liberating in those ways, is a serious consideration. So hence this concept of a trial in absentia of persons of European descent, not to do what those people have done in a bourgeois context, the European supremacists have done in the bourgeois context of harming these people of the underclass, these workers, African Americans or Native Americans who were conscripted into similar circumstances, are the best example in a certain light. The best example, I wouldn't describe this as good situation, but the truest example of the worker, right? The worker is somebody who has their labor value stolen by the elites, and a person who has 100% of their labor value stolen by the elites. The slave is by class analysis the truest of workers, right? But that's not the way that this is viewed because of this Jake Sakai settlers type effect. So you try the Europeans in absentia because this is presumably in a situation where private wealth has been abolished, right? You say, well, the planet's going to die in 5 years if we don't impose a humane and sustainable economic system, which requires removing finance capital completely from the equation. So that's already happened in this framework. So this trial in absentia of Europeans, North Americans of European descent, is then a thing to further ensure a thing in the spirit of that, but more in this area of ensuring that you don't have fascist creep through this continued political disenfranchisement of these the rightful owners of this land, which would absolutely happen if you don't do this thing. So then by something like this trial in absentia, what you can then do is ensure that the institution is run with these rightful owners in mind, so that you can ultimately have a thing where everyone on that continent does have their material conditions vouchsafed, which is not something that you can do when you continue to have those any vestiges of the white supremacist institution that's built up. I remember when I was a kid, this first kind of proto-Marxist moments in my life is learning about American history, and you would have a history teacher who says, who describes a whole host of institutions that are all basically derived from chattel slavery, and then says, but this is a system, right? It's good now. It's all basically acknowledging that it's all the fruit of a poison tree, but then saying somehow that it's a system that we must uphold and participate in. And I remember looking at that, it was a 10-year-old little pen, and being like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why would you even say, how could you even say that with a straight face? That's what almost everybody's doing, right? So you got to get to the point where that's not the case. The system's just laughably hateful and bad. And this trial and absentia concept, there's a lot of other ways that you could do that, of course. The point is that you can't build the people's government on a bad foundation, such as that of European supremacy.